Les Canadiens iront donc aux urnes le 20 septembre. Nous, on a un vrai plan. Chaque décision compte. On va continuer à développer des vraies solutions.
Les Canadiens méritent un vrai leader. Ensemble, on va agir pour l'avenir. Il faut toujours avoir un plan. Looking good.
Le Bloc a un projet.
Ce qui est important pour nous, c'est de mettre de l'avant ce qui sera bon pour le Québec. Alors, allons-y.
Let's do this.
Je veux devenir le prochain Premier ministre pour aider les gens.
Pour une société plus juste et plus égalitaire.
Mon job, c'est de gagner des sièges. Notre attention doit être ciblée sur les solutions.
Vous avez un choix dans cette élection. Il y a 5 partis, mais 2 choix.
Le choix va appartenir aux Québécois.
C'est aux Canadiens de décider.
Les Canadiens méritent d'avoir leur mot à dire.
En direct du Musée canadien de l'histoire à Gatineau.
Live from the Museum of History in Gatineau,
vous présente le
we now
débat
present
du chef.
the Leaders' Debate.
Voici Patrice Roy.
Here is Patrice Roy.
Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Leaders' Debate.
Au Musée canadien de l'histoire.
We're at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, and more specifically, we're in the Grand Hall, which has been transformed into a television studio over the past few
Ce
days.
débat est largement diffusé.
This debate is being broadcast widely by a number of partner networks, and it's being interpreted into several different languages.
Déjà aux interprètes
And I want to tip my hat to the interpreters that I was speaking to backstage.
à traduire en temps réel.
Good luck. It's not always easy.
Et l'ordre de parole ont évidemment
The placement of the leaders and the speaking order has been randomly determined. Good evening, Mr. O'Toole, Mr. Trudeau,
Madame Paul, bonsoir.
Ms. Paul,
Good evening.
Bonsoir.
Mr. Singh,
Monsieur Blanchet.
and Mr. Blanchet.
Bien, bonsoir tout le monde.
Bonsoir. Good evening,
Thank you for
everyone.
being here.
C'est un exercice sain.
These debates are a valuable exercise in our democracy.
On l'oublie parfois ici.
That's sometimes forgotten.
Seront abordés ce soir. Chaque thème
5 themes will be discussed tonight, and we'll kick off each theme with a question from a member of the public. Noémie Mercier, good evening. We received about 1,000 questions, is that right? Yes, some really intelligent and relevant questions that really inspired us as we were preparing tonight's debate.
Il y aura des
We're looking forward to that. Now, there will be 2-way debates, then followed by 3-way debates, and there will be a series of rapid-fire questions from our guest journalists. And each block will end with an open debate involving all 5 leaders. And of course, we'll aim to have the speaking time distributed equally among the leaders.
le premier thème.
Before starting on the first theme,
Une première question.
I want to ask a first question to all of the leaders, and they'll have 45 seconds each to answer. So rather than an opening statement, they'll have 45 seconds to answer this
Je
question.
pense qu'on peut s'entendre.
This is an election that I think people would probably agree, maybe not Mr. Trudeau, but I think most of us would agree that this was not a wanted election. But that's the past. Now I want to turn to the future.
Engagez-vous si vous gagnez un
If you were to win a minority government,
pas déclenché.
would you commit to not calling a snap election, but to respect the 4-year term?
Autrement dit,
Mr. Trudeau, in other words, would you not do the same thing twice? And Mr. Trudeau, you're the first to answer. 45
Thank
seconds.
you, Patrice. First of all, I'd like to thank Canadians from all across the country for joining us this evening and for all the work you've done throughout the pandemic so that we can get through it. We continue to get through it. And I'd like to focus on the expression Patrice used, an election that nobody wanted. You are going to hear different perspectives this evening and radically different approaches to how we should put the pandemic behind us, how we should rebuild, build back better. And you deserve a choice, because the government you elect will make those decisions now in the fall, not a year or 2 from now, because climate change, decisions on firearms and vaccination, you have important choices to make, and I'm looking forward to working
Thank you,
with
Mr.
you.
Trudeau. Now, Mr. O'Toole, again, the question is, if you were elected at the head of a minority government, would you commit to not calling a snap election before 4 years?
Yes, absolutely. We need to work together to fight the pandemic and to meet the challenges that are awaiting us after the pandemic. This isn't the time for an election. We need to have a plan for the future, as you said, Mr. Roy, for the future. And at the beginning of the campaign, we launched our plan, Canada's Recovery Plan. It's a plan with 5 pillars: jobs, an anti-corruption act, leadership when it comes to Canadians' mental health, a plan to be more ready for future pandemics, and a plan to balance the budget. Because after 6 years of Mr. Trudeau, we have a lot of debt and no opportunity for our young people.
Now, at the beginning of your question, you said absolutely. Do you mean
We
absolutely
need to
you
work
wouldn't call an election?
together on our economic recovery in the pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. 45 seconds.
Thank you very much, first of all. Good evening to everyone. I would like to clearly state that we did not want this election. We want to work together. I'm committed to meeting the Canadians' mandate and your voice, what you will choose, because you have an important choice to make in this election. You have the choice of another 4 years of Mr. Trudeau that allowed some people to exploit the system. You could also choose the NDP that are clearly saying that billionaires have to pay their fair share to help us fight climate change, to invest in healthcare, and to clearly say that we will end the housing crisis. You have a clear choice, and I encourage you to choose the NDP.
Mr. Blanchet, will you do everything possible to keep the next government alive? That's the spirit of the question.
I'm not the one who's going to make the decision. However, I think that the government must ensure, when it's a minority government, to get the support of enough MPs in the government to remain in its position. That is the spirit of the law on fixed dates. Now, Mr. Trudeau did talk about the fact that we could be in an election in another 18 months. But it's interesting that he didn't table his own platform until 2 weeks after he called the election. Here in the Bloc, we don't have the same philosophy. If it's good for Quebec, we vote for it. If it's bad for Quebec, we vote against it. But regardless of what's on the table, we will improve it.
We'll get back to that in greater detail later. But Ms. Paul, I want to ask you the same question. Would you do everything possible to keep a minority government in power as long as possible?
First of all, it's an honor to be here on the unceded Algonquin territory, Miigwech. Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, given the broken promises by Mr. Trudeau and his government, we are now in this situation. We need to find a way to work together in collaboration and cooperation. The fact that we are in an election is a symptom or a consequence of the fact that people are not looking to work together, and they're working in a partisan manner. I would say that people don't want to be consulted on how to end the pandemic. They want it to end, and we need to work together to do that.
Thank you very much. You've all stuck to your time limits very well, so we appreciate that. Our first theme tonight, it's a very big one, the pandemic and healthcare. Noemi, we have a question from the public. Yes, we received a lot of questions on this theme. So more than 27,000 people died of COVID-19 in Canada, and at least half of them died in seniors' residences, sometimes in quite horrific conditions and often alone. Our first guest is Bernadette Landry, who is in Dieppe in New Brunswick. Good evening, Ms. Landry. Good evening. Thank you for being with us and for starting us off tonight. Now, you're involved in an association in New Brunswick that defends the rights of seniors. And there's something that you want to ask the leaders. Please go ahead. Yes. The pandemic has really revealed how seniors can be neglected and mistreated, particularly seniors who are vulnerable and who are starting to lose their independence. So far, it doesn't seem like we can count on provincial governments to protect seniors in long-term care. This is something that's been going on for a really long time. So if you became Prime Minister, what would you do to ensure that the provincial governments protect seniors who are becoming less independent so that they are no longer neglected? Thank you very much, Ms. Landry. I know the leaders were listening attentively to your question, so let's hear their answers. We're starting with Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you for the question, Bernadette. We will have a clear approach when it comes to Canadians and Quebecers' health for our seniors. We will increase the health transfer in a stable, predictable, and unconditional way, and it's going to go up by about $60 billion. We're going to work together on our public and universal healthcare system, and particularly after the pandemic. We need to learn lessons. We need to work together on our residences for our long-term care homes in Quebec in particular. That's why we're planning $3 billion for investments in long-term care homes, in seniors' homes. I will respect provincial jurisdiction, but we need to work together.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Ms. Paul.
My father died in a long-term care home in the second wave of the pandemic, and I will never forget that. I will not forget all of the thousands of people who have lost a loved one. Unfortunately, we are forgetting them. We need to have a radical reform of our system. We need to have national standards. There must be a way to ensure that our system falls under the Canada Health Act, because the protections are in that act. We need to ensure a minimum number of care and services for our seniors. There was nothing in the throne speech for seniors.
Mr. Blanchet. Ms. Landry was saying that the provincial governments can't be counted on. How would you reply?
It's very sad to hear what Ms. Landry has to say, because we need to realize that the priority of the provincial healthcare systems is to provide care to people, and to do that, they need resources. And the federal contribution to each of the provinces, well, they're all calling for an increase in health transfers for care for people, to reduce wait lists, and for healthcare personnel. The Liberals and the other parties as well, what they want to do is to give that money, but with strings attached, because they claim that the federal government knows more about that than the provincial governments. But the provinces are the ones that have expertise.
Thank you very much. First of all, a big thank you to you, Ms. Landry, for your question. It's a crying national shame what has happened during this pandemic. The fact that our seniors have been the hardest hit, it truly breaks my heart, and you are right. We have to help people. Personally, I can't simply be passive when I see people suffer. Yes, I respect various jurisdictions, but I want to help. I'm looking for solutions, and I think that a leader is someone who looks for solutions, not someone who's looking for excuses. And so what we want to do is to remove profits from long-term care homes to help people. We want there to be better support so that people can remain at home as much as possible. Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole voted against this idea.
Thanks for wrapping up there, Mr. Singh. Mr. Trudeau.
Thanks, Ms. Landry, for your question. Like millions of Canadians, I watched with horror what happened to seniors, the most vulnerable all across the country during this pandemic. Not just in one place like New Brunswick, it was everywhere. We have to do better. Yes, the federal government sent soldiers, members of the armed forces, to help out, but we can only conclude that the situation of seniors was not only unfortunate during the pandemic, it started long before. The federal government has to respect provincial jurisdiction, has to respect the role the provinces are supposed to play, but we have worked to improve funding and improve working conditions for healthcare workers. We will be there for everyone.
So, Ms. Landry, we saw your reaction to some of the leaders' answers. Were you satisfied? Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for participating tonight. Well, that's encouraging. Thank you, Ms. Landry. We'll be coming back to the subject during the open debate with all 5 leaders, talking more about long-term care homes, the role of the federal government and the provincial government. But now we're moving on to the two-way debate with Ms. Paul and Mr. Singh. And I want to talk about vaccinations. Ms. Paul, it's not really clear to me whether you are against mandatory vaccination. I'm not entirely sure what you said a couple of weeks ago. Perhaps you can clarify. And Mr. Singh, you're very strongly in support of mandatory vaccinations, but are you not concerned that it might further provoke the anti-vaxxer protesters and those who don't want to get vaccinated? And is there a risk of creating two worlds in Canada?
It is so sad to see the politicization of an issue like this. Its concerns our health. Absolutely. We are in favor of ensuring that everybody that can get vaccinated be vaccinated. I think that all the parties are in agreement with this.
Yes, I entirely agree with Ms. Paul. That is exactly what we have to do. We have to help people to get vaccinated. We have to increase resources to help them towards vaccination. I don't want to divide our population. What I want to do is protect our population. That is also the reason for which I would like to come back to Ms. Landry's question. What happened in long-term care homes, like Ms. Paul said, was absolutely horrible. What we have learned is that in these long-term care homes, these for-profit long-term care homes, that's where the worst conditions were. And so why did Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole vote for privatized services?
Yes, but let's come back to the vaccination.
But to get back to mandatory vaccination.
I wanted just to say that was half of my answer. In fact, I wanted to say that it's very clear that we need accommodations for those who are unable to get vaccinated. There are rapid tests. There are other options. We know full well that we need to use these tools, use something that is guided by science and the information from experts.
I'd like to hear Mr. Singh on this. Would you agree with the Premier of Quebec, who said that those who refuse to get vaccinated should be suspended without pay? Would you go that far?
I would like to say that yes, there should be consequences, but we have to do everything we can to help people to get vaccinated. We can find other ways to help people, and those who simply cannot get vaccinated, we can find other solutions for them.
Yes, and I want to know what are the consequences, because if we can come together and agree, it's much better than if we are in disagreement.
Well, that's why I'm asking the question, because I'm trying to figure out the nuances between your arguments, and sometimes people aren't really clear on your positions. Now, Mr. Blanchet, Trudeau, and O'Toole. Mr. Trudeau, we've seen you being almost mobbed by protesters throughout the campaign, so I'd like to ask you the same question. Are we not creating a vicious cycle in Canada where the more you try to force people to get vaccinated, the more people protest? Are we not politicizing this question?
But it's a false debate. There's no longer any debate about vaccination. That is the way to get out of this crisis. That's what the experts are saying. And there's a distinction between the mobs that are demonstrating and those who, for personal reasons, are hesitating about getting vaccinated. Yes, they need to get information, but we need to show them also that it's in their interest to get the jab so that they can take a train or a plane or work for the federal public service with vaccine passports that will be funded. They'll be able to go to the gym or the theater. So it's important. Vaccination is the way to go because the vast majority of Canadians have done the right
O'Toole,
thing.
Have you changed your mind on this? You're still against mandatory vaccinations.
Vaccines are essential. Vaccines are safe and effective, and I encourage all Canadians and all Quebecers to get vaccinated. But in the middle of a pandemic, this isn't the time to be dividing people. We need to work together. We need to work together at every level of government. We need to use all the tools we have: vaccines, daily rapid testing, masks, physical distancing. But in the middle of a pandemic, why did Mr. Trudeau call an election? We need to work to fight the fourth wave, not on having an election.
Mr. O'Toole is saying that vaccination and testing is the same thing, but it's not at all the same thing.
Why did you call elections, Mr. Trudeau? Why in the middle of a pandemic? Why? We need to help Canadians. We need to fight together to fight COVID-19, not with this divisive approach.
He asked me a direct question. Why this happened during the pandemic? Why have an election during a pandemic? And that's precisely because Canadians need to have a say in how we get out of this. Mr. O'Toole doesn't want that, but it's a clear choice, and Canadians should have a say. They should have a say on that.
First of all, When I was young, the guy at the corner store said that I wouldn't have set a fire to something, but neither would I have put it out. And that's what I'm thinking of when I hear these two, because we're talking about education. You know, people need to know that it's important to be vaccinated. And this confrontation is...
this has been going on for months, Mr. Blanchet.
Now, for example, what Mr. Trudeau referred to, he's trying to divert us from the borders that he didn't close in time. And Quebec has already put in place a vaccine passport.
And I trust the different levels of government. We need to work together with them.
That was only to divert attention.
You'll be able to come back to that. Comme mes collègues viendront plus tard, j'ai des questions en rafale pour chacun d'entre vous. C'est un mélange entre une formule ouverte et des questions en rafale pour que les citoyens puissent comprendre
and questions from the citizens to help all the citizens understand what underlies your policies.
Tout le hasard qui a déterminé les noms, vous le savez.
Now, of course, the names were chosen
Assurance
randomly.
médicaments, assurance dentaire,
drug coverage,
plus de
dental
soins dans les
coverage,
CHS.
more care in long-term care
Votre
facilities.
programme, disons, est ambitieux.
Let's say that your program
mais
is
pas
ambitious,
chiffré.
but
Comment
not costed.
peut-on vous prendre au sérieux?
How can we take you seriously?
We are costing the program, and it's only been 2 years since the last election. We had a costed program. Unfortunately, now we find ourselves in another election. It's the time to be ambitious. I think that the pandemic has changed things. It's upset myself, my family, and I believe that people want to take a different path. We can't go on the same path we were on. If we want to do this, we need to say, yes, we must be ambitious. We must be bold. We must propose that everybody lives with dignity in Canada and have everything they...
Very well, but still not costed.
No, not yet, but it is coming.
When? There are 2 weeks left.
In fact, the election was called, and it's 36 days long, the campaign, and this happened.
Of course, there are provincial jurisdictions. Everyone's sensitive to that, especially in Quebec. But why refuse any collaboration with the federal government? I remind you that there were 5,718 deaths in long-term care facilities in Quebec, many more than in Ontario. Isn't there some room here for openness and modesty, Mr. Blanchet?
Your reasoning states that because it was the Quebec system, because it was the Quebec standards, that it's not as good as if it had been Canadian or national standards. Now, it's not the federal government that hires nurses and so forth. The federal government should have given us more money, because then, from all the provinces, because they're all calling for more money, and if we had had that, then our health systems would have been more robust and we could have faced the crisis better. Because I am not going to speculate on this.
Very well. Mr. O'Toole, do you believe that Canadians should have the choice to pay out of pocket to gain access to surgery or care sooner than in the public system?
I will always respect provincial jurisdiction and the decisions made by the provinces, because, like Mr. Blanchet said, this is provincial jurisdiction. And I will increase the health transfers in a stable, predictable, and unconditional way, or without conditions, because it's a question of respect. And I trust the government of Quebec. Why does Mr. Trudeau always interfere in provincial jurisdiction, particularly after the pandemic? Given the sad situation in the long-term care homes, we need to work together for the well-being of Canadians and Quebecers, and that's why we have a plan for Canada's recovery and historic investments in our public health care system.
So not more private health care? That was my question.
I support our universal public system.
Mr. Trudeau, here's a simple question for you. How much does a dose of vaccine cost? In Europe, we've seen some numbers come out now. Don't Canadians have the right to know and find out whether we got a good deal?
What Canadians know is that we invested enough money to put us at the top of the list in terms of vaccination in the world. We have enough for everyone. We've paid competitive prices.
But why aren't you providing those numbers
and I
for
can't
transparency?
talk about the contracts we entered into with private companies, but we're trying to be as transparent as possible. I'd like to come back to what my colleague said. Mr. O'Toole doesn't understand that it's the federal government's role to defend the Canada Health Act, which prevents the private sector from intruding into the healthcare sector, even in the provinces. He's not standing up against a two-tier system. And Mr. Blanchet is forgetting that when the armed forces entered into the long-term care facilities in Quebec, now we still don't have all the answers.
We'll be able to move on to that debate a little later. Mr. Singh. We're still talking about the pandemic. You are proposing free mental health care for all those who suffered from the pandemic. Congratulations. But where do you get your psychologists? There already is a severe shortage. There are 910 spots that are unfilled in
This
Canada.
is a very problematic issue. We have to highlight that during this pandemic, while there were already problems with regards to accessing mental health care before the pandemic, the situation got even worse during the pandemic. And these are truly difficult times that have had severe impacts on many people's mental health. So what we want to make sure is that people have access to this essential service. That means including mental health care in our general healthcare system. It will be difficult, but it is necessary to do so, and that's what we will do.
Very well. Moving on to the open debate for 5 minutes. Mr. O'Toole, you were randomly selected to begin. This round, Canada has just reopened its borders to foreign visitors yesterday, those that are doubly vaccinated. Are you comfortable with this, Mr. O'Toole?
We need to have a safe border in the middle of a pandemic, and that's why we need to look at the level of vaccination in other countries, particularly in the United States, but we also need to use rapid daily testing at the border. I proposed that a year ago, and unfortunately, as usual, Mr. Trudeau's government didn't move forward on that. They moved forward very slowly on testing. They moved forward slowly with vaccines in the middle of a pandemic. It's possible to have an open border, but a safe border. It's very important in the middle of a pandemic.
Well, we know full well that we're now seeing a fourth wave among the unvaccinated. Those who did the right thing and did their part for society, they are not a source of risk, and they can resume a more or less normal life. And we are seeing international travelers who are double vaccinated because we want things to get back to normal. So we're making sure that that will not be a vector of transmission, that international travel will not be a vector, and we want to make sure that those who've done the right thing, and I don't see why Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Blanchet are not backing down on vaccination.
We are in a fourth wave of COVID-19. Mr. Trudeau, it was the wrong thing to do, to trigger an election. There are still challenges to surmount. The only reason for which you decided to trigger an election is a selfish one, to obtain more power. That was not the right thing to do. And so, in our opinion, we should have continued to stand strong against this pandemic, to help people, and to realize that this pandemic simply is not over. There are still issues that have to be rectified. We have to realize it and we have to act. So why did you trigger these elections? It's a complete nonsense.
I completely agree with Mr. Singh on this point. There are options. You can blame people who are angry and not vaccinated, or you can try to educate them, try to bring them together. We have already talked about investing in mental health services, in long-term care homes, and other issues. We must be back in Parliament to talk about these things together, to find solutions. and provide the assistance that people need because this is still a pandemic.
Mr. Blanchet, are you concerned
I
about the
agree with the
open
principle
borders?
that the double vaccination is a very good standard and it should be coordinated with other countries, because many of them travel here. However, I would, not, at least I didn't put out my platform 2 weeks late, and at least my platform is clear. And also, what about the capacity of Canada under this government to have exchanges? Because even the President Biden isn't very available to speak to our Prime Minister. And yet we have the longest shared border in the world. And so there are many unclear issues with this government.
To answer the question about the calling of an election again, well, viewers can see how deep the differences are in our positions on how the pandemic should be dealt with. And this is something Canadians should have a say in. That demonstrates that. For the healthcare system, we are proposing about $25 billion in investments in family doctors, in mental health over the next 4 years, Mr. Singh. And we will absolutely do that. We are the only ones who are calling for demanding results from the provinces. We'll work with them, but we'll assume our responsibilities.
How about a quick yes or no from each of you? Now,
I have the right to it.
So we already know your answer, but are you going to
Of course, I will demand that that amount be transferred.
$28 billion, yes or no?
Yes, we want to increase health care transfers.
But not
we want to
$28 billion.
increase them. We want to increase
That's
them.
quite vague as an answer. Ms. Paul.
We have invited the provinces to be there at the table with the government, the federal government, to negotiate. It's not really a negotiation, it's rather to create and ensure a fundamental reform because there are shortcomings.
25 billion, yes. 25 billion for health care, and I will work with the provinces to deliver results. 25 billion.
Over $60 billion over the next 10 years without conditions because it's a question of respect.
Very well. Thank you for the first open debate. Cost of living and public finances. We have a question from the audience. The labor shortage is severe and is very costly for businesses and for our communities too. We're going to talk to someone who is being affected by this shortage. His name is Marc-Antoine Poulin, and he's joining us from his home in Saint-Prosper. Good evening, Mr. Poulin. Good evening, Noémie. Thank you for joining us. You work for a small business in the Beauce region that manufactures hardwood floors, and it's difficult for you to recruit employees. What would you like to say to the leaders? In my region, all sectors are affected. We see companies having to postpone projects, slowing down their operations for lack of staff, and community organizations are having the same struggle. It's hard for them to recruit employees, and it may even be difficult for them to provide the services they should to the citizens. So what is your party's plan to address the labor shortage? Thank you for that question, Mr. Poulin. That's quite clear as a question. What will you be doing to address the labor shortage? Mr. Singh, you go first.
I missed his surname.
What was his last name?
Thank you very much, Mr. Poulin, for your question. My apologies for missing your name. This is a huge issue. You've raised how serious it is in your region. It has affected many people. It has affected industry and companies. This is very difficult, and it has struck the country as a whole as well. We have a number of solutions. We can better use our immigration system to welcome new arrivals to Canada that would help us to tackle this labor shortage. We can also help through education, through training that can connect people to companies that need their help. These are a number of measures we can take.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Mr. Blanchet?
4 proposals for you, Mr. Poulin. The first is to the temporary suspension of the CRB, because that is holding back people who could be on the labor force. And of course, I would keep an exception for arts and culture. A more generous tax credit for young retirees who could continue to work for a few days per week, and openness to immigration based on the capacity to integrate, because here in Quebec we need people who speak French. And also I would look at supporting volunteerism, because that is a very strong workforce, and many people could perhaps benefit from a tax credit, especially in the community area.
Thank you very much for that response. Mr. Trudeau, you have the floor.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Poulin. I visited the Beauce a number of years ago and saw how active the business community is. It's well known in your region. The labor shortage has been a problem during the pandemic and even before, and that's why we've invested in labor training, in skills training, and in immigration. But you might be interested in the hiring benefit we're proposing. That will help increase wages that you offer your workers to encourage people to come and look for work there, because we know that the economic recovery has to happen quickly and all across the country.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you, Mr. Poulin. I have a lot of respect for entrepreneurs and the family farms in the Beauce. This labor shortage is a risk for every region, and we need to face this challenge. And that's why in my contract with Quebecers, I will give more power in immigration to Quebec, and that's very important, particularly for foreign workers in the agricultural sector. It's absolutely necessary to have workers. We also need to take a collaborative approach on training, and we need to reduce the emergency programs like the CRB, because we have a shortage and we need to focus on work after the pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Ms. Paul, after you to close this portion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Poulin, for that question. Another example of an issue that needs to be discussed in Parliament, because individuals and businesses still need help because we're in the middle of a pandemic. I would say that immigration, training, coordination and cooperation, we must cooperate and coordinate with companies in order to know where the shortages are, and we need to have better training that corresponds to the needs of businesses as well, and I know that the workers also want that. And immigration. We are a country that can welcome many people, and that is also a solution.
Thank you. Ms. Paul. Mr. Poulin, thank you very much for sharing your perspective with us. Do you feel illuminated by the leaders' responses? Yes, it was quite instructive. Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Poulin. Have a good night. Thank you, Mr. Poulin. Greatly appreciated. That may be the question that we hear the most. The issue of labor shortages across the country. Mr. Blanchet, Mr. Trudeau, you now have a two-way showdown. Let's begin with Mr. Blanchet. So you said except for the arts and cultural sector, it's time to end the CRB.
What we're saying, and I hope this is going to be a cordial exchange rather than a confrontation, but we have gone across Quebec many times, and we have observed people, businesses, especially small and medium-sized businesses, because the very large businesses remain competitive in order to attract labor. But we've seen restaurants close down, we've seen gas stations close down, we've seen that communities are simply collapsing. And so people are saying, please, can you stop the Canada Recovery Benefit? So I think that's perhaps a bit much, because there might be a fourth way that's even stronger than what we've seen so far. We can't predict the future, but the CRB could become necessary again, especially so it should be suspended except for in the arts and culture for the good of the economy.
So by the end of October, it'll be suspended?
agree that in all my tours around Quebec, there has been this labor shortage for years. The pandemic didn't create it. The CRB and the CERB didn't create this labor shortage. It's already down to $300 a week, which is below minimum wage, but we do recognize that for a strong recovery, a strong economic recovery, we need to support businesses, we need to support hiring, and that's why we've created a hiring incentive, and that's why we'll continue boosting immigration and increasing labor training, and we need direct assistance for companies. We are going to be there for people. We're talking about not just workers, but also companies. That's what we did during the pandemic, and that's what we're going to keep doing.
I would urge the government, regardless of which government is elected, to work on productivity. How do we create more wealth with fewer people? Well, then we have to work on productivity, not to announce job promises and improve the productivity of businesses.
And that's precisely what we're doing with a digital program for small business. There's a digital transition that's going on to increase productivity.
We will have the opportunity to come back to that. And that was quite cordial. Thank you very much, Mr. Blanchet. Mr. O'Toole, Ms. Paul and Mr. Singh now have the right to speak. So let's come back to the CRB, Mr. O'Toole. By the end of October, let's say you're Prime Minister. What happens then?
We need to reduce the emergency programs in a fair way. Stop it if there's no further risk, for example, of a fifth wave. We need to focus on health and the well-being of Canadians and Quebecers, but we need to have an economic recovery. We know that our small businesses, hotels, restaurants, the tourism sector are in crisis. We have a specific plan for small businesses who are suffering.
I completely disagree. What we have actually seen is that if someone isn't working because they earn $1,200, it's not an issue with CRB. It's a question of inadequate salaries. People want to work. Now, to come back to the cost of living is ever increasing. Housing is ever more expensive also. Mr. Trudeau had 6 years to act. Whilst he has been Prime Minister, and up to now, the price of housing has gone up. So it's very difficult for people to deal with it.
We'll be talking about that later, but right now the subject is the CRB, and you're saying it will continue.
Yes, of course, we will continue to help people. Clearly, we are in the middle of a fourth wave.
I would like the leaders who think it's time to end the benefits to come to my riding, to see marginalized individuals who are working in the social services sector, who need this benefit to survive. It's not even enough. They are threatened with being kicked out of their housing. Yes, we need that. And I'd like to go further and say it's the time to start thinking about replacing these emergency benefits with a guaranteed livable income, because there are problems and we cannot fix them.
I agree, and what we have seen in this pandemic is Mr. Trudeau's decisions. Rather than making sure that big companies that took public money and used it in a unjudicious way, instead of doing so, but this has to go to the people. That's
with the NDP and Mr. Trudeau, we're going to see unlimited spending, and that's going
You're on the
to
same side.
be
You're
debt
both
to our
on the
children.
same side.
I'm going to double the Canada Workers' Benefit, and I will fight for small businesses.
It's always an excellent investment to invest in people.
Okay, well, that exchange is a little bit less
Investing in
cordial.
people is a good investment.
Paul. I'd now like to invite my colleague Hélène Bizetti to ask some questions, and I'll take this opportunity while she gets set up to remind you that if you speak at the same time, things won't work. And that'll be the last warning. Hélène, good evening. Good evening. One at a time, please. Yes, Mr. Trudeau, we'll start with you. Mr. Inflation hit 3.7%, which is a 10-year high. Gas, groceries, just about everything is more expensive, and many believe that your massive spending is partly to blame. So what guarantee do we have that the billions in additional spending you're proposing will not further increase the cost of living?
That's a great question. The investments we're making like $10 a day daycare all across the country and more spots in Quebec, and our investments to help families to save for the purchase of their first home, investments we're making to support cultural industries, tourism industries, and workers in those industries. We are there to support people. I made a promise at the outset of the pandemic to help people for as long as it took, and that produced great results, but also boosted economic growth.
Keep things up unnecessarily. If interest rates increase, what will happen to people who have big mortgages, for example?
We want to create economic growth, but we will manage inflation because we need to keep the cost of living affordable for families.
Mr. O'Toole, you tabled the costing of your platform just a couple of hours ago, so you'll have to excuse me if I didn't have time to analyze it properly. But if I've understood correctly, your plan is to keep most of the spending of the last Liberal budget, add some other Conservative spending, and yet you're also going to manage to explain the deficit. Explain how that works.
With our Canada's Recovery Plan, we will balance the budget over a decade with an approach that is focused on workers and an economic recovery in every sector and in every region. And that's why we are going to make investments to help families with mental health, with small businesses who are facing a crisis, but we need to have an economic recovery for a strong economy. And we have a plan for that. And there's a crisis in the cost of living right now because of the unlimited spending from Mr. Trudeau.
But you're actually promising to maintain some of that spending. So how do you reconcile this? What is this
No,
magical effect that
absolutely
you're
not.
going to use?
We have a plan to balance the budget, but we need to create jobs. Our first pillar is to create 1 million jobs in 1 year.
That's all the time we have. Mr. Blanchet, it looks like we're headed for a minority government, which would mean that the government would need the support of one or even two opposition parties to pass legislation. So in that context, what conditions would you place on supporting a budget? The $28 billion in healthcare funding for the provinces, for example, would that be non-negotiable for you?
Yes, it's a deal breaker, because I am wondering here at this stage in the campaign, is there any one of the major parties here who deserves a majority? Has anyone shown, that they are available, that they are prepared to lead our country for 4 years with something that has a plan, not just something that's wishful thinking, but with an actual vision? The Bloc always has the same philosophy. If it's good for Quebec, we support it. Health transfers.
But the three main parties didn't commit to giving the $28 billion.
Well, they will have to agree among themselves, because I hear that there's a lot of scorn about Quebec's jurisdiction. I always hear that it's better in Canada than in Quebec, and all the provinces say we need these health transfers with no strings attached. It's $28 billion plus 6%.
Thank you. Mr. Singh, you've proposed spending billions, even more than the Liberals. You often say that you'll make the ultra-rich pay. You even mentioned Amazon. But with respect to Mr. Singh, Jeff Bezos lives in the U.S., and people almost always overestimate what they can actually recoup from cracking down on tax evasion. So isn't this just magical thinking?
I believe that this is a question of fairness. If you work here in Canada, if you have a company or a business here in Canada, you have to pay your fair share. Big web giants, for example, don't pay their fair share. And this is simply unfair. Other countries have started to do so. France has proposed taxing revenue for big companies. We want to invest in people, but we don't want to do it like Mr. Trudeau or Mr. O'Toole by putting more pressure on the people. We have a credible plan that says that we want to make sure that billionaires pay their fair share.
But is that money really going to be available? I mean, wealthy people can move their assets elsewhere, so how would you get the money?
No, I think that first of all, we can stop tax havens and tax loopholes. Through that, we will get more revenue to reinvest in the people.
Ms. Paul, like Mr. Singh, you still haven't tabled the costing of your platform, but we know that you're proposing a guaranteed minimum income. Now, when we look at the size of the current deficit, can we really afford to make the CRB permanent?
We know that the parliamentary budget officer has already said that, yes, it is possible. And yes, it's possible to have a guaranteed minimum income. We call it a guaranteed livable income. And that would lift 50% of the people out of poverty. We also know that despite all our collective efforts, that there are shortcomings that remain. And we live in a country that is very rich, and this is shameful.
People are talking about a labor shortage and 800,000 job vacancies. So how can you make people work if you're paying them to stay home?
We have to ensure people get a salary to earn a decent living, pay for their housing. It's time to ensure a livable income.
Thank you. That's all the time.
I know the other parties agree with me.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Now, open debate. You can all participate. We are randomly going to start with Mr. Singh. But I do just want to say, first of all, that we're going to be talking about daycares. We've also seen that daycare is a way to get women into the labor force. So I'd like to hear your positions on this. And Mr. O'Toole, I want to ask you the question that we're all waiting for, which is what's going to happen to the $6 billion? And Mr. Singh, what do you think about daycare?
It's an excellent idea. I would like to commend all the activists that push the government to actually deliver on this matter. I would like to note that Mr. Trudeau and his party promised this for the past 30 years. That means the past 3 decades, promises after promises, and only now they've finally started to act. If Mr. Trudeau really wanted to have acted as quickly as possible, why did he trigger an election rather than continue his work? It's completely unacceptable, and people can't simply be duped by Mr. Trudeau and believe what he's saying.
The costing of your platform was just revealed a few hours ago. Now, it appears to be clear that you're going to be eliminating the $6 billion that was planned for Quebec and the other provinces. But you're trying to have it both ways here. So can you confirm there won't be any check given to Quebec for the daycares? That will be replaced by your tax credit?
We are going to help all Quebec families immediately, and we're going to help low-income families with by paying back 75% of their costs for daycare. And we will always respect provincial jurisdiction, including Quebec's system, and that's why we are going to coordinate with Mr. Legault's government in close collaboration, and we have a budget in our platform. We have the numbers, and there's going to be a transition, because our plan is going to help all families in Quebec, and families are going to be in charge of their own decisions.
No surprise.
Mr. Trudeau is only going to deliver in 5 or 6 years.
He doesn't understand the daycare system in Quebec, because we wanted that to be a model for the rest of the country. He says he'd rather have a tax credit for the most vulnerable families in Quebec. Those families don't pay for daycare already in Quebec. It's subsidized.
And
so he doesn't understand the first
thing
about the system in Quebec. He's going to scrap the $6 billion that would have created 37,000 new daycare spots in Quebec. Quebec families have been waiting for months and even years for more spaces in daycare. And he says, no, we're going to have a tax credit instead. We're going to create 250,000 new spots across the country, and Mr. O'Toole would scrap it all.
I think that perhaps we need some more discipline here. First of all, the Conservatives' plan, we've heard plan from Mr. O'Toole. That's $6 billion less in the pockets of the Quebec government. I can't wait to hear the expression of how much the Conservatives love Quebec, what Mr. O'Toole is going to say when he hears this announcement. And I might remind you that Mr. Trudeau's system, thank you, was created by Ms. Marois. And that, for me, is the very demonstration of how important it is to keep the programs created by Quebec and administered by Quebec in Quebec. We do not need any interference or any conditions from the federal government to tell us how to do our own thing.
I wonder if all the men here would let a woman speak about an issue that affects women more than any other. And I'd also like to know whether the other leaders of the parties here, if there were more women representing their parties, particularly leaders, if it would take decades to do something that is a right and essential for women in order to work. So yes, for daycares, universal daycares. And yes, it's unfortunate for myself and other women who work with children that it didn't happen in the last session of Parliament.
All right. All right. I think we've understood your positions. And Mr. O'Toole, you said that you have a different idea and you won't be setting the $6 billion.
We are going to collaborate and coordinate with the government. We have a budget in our platform, and we have the numbers for this because we need to help all families and work closely with the provinces.
Thank you. Well, actually, I think we're maintaining discipline quite well here, and everyone is actually sticking to their time extremely well. So let's move on to the next theme. The environment, an essential theme tonight. Now we have a very interesting question. That's right. Canadians are feeling the effects of climate change more than ever in the last few months. Many experienced crippling heat this summer. Hundreds died in the heat wave in Western Canada in June. And the village of Lytton in British Columbia hit 49.5 degrees Celsius, an all-time record for Canada. In fact, our country is warming twice as fast as the global average. And the only way to avoid climate catastrophe, as we know, is to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is an issue that concerns young people very much because they're the ones who are going to have to live with the consequences of the decisions that are made today. Charles Leduc is 11 years old. He lives in Saint-Clet in Montérégie. Good evening, Charles.
Bonsoir.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being with us and welcome to the Leaders' Debate. Now, when you see the growing number of forest fires, heat waves, and hurricanes, this concerns you, right? And I believe there's a question you want to ask the leaders, so go ahead. That's true. I'm concerned about this. So my question is, what will you do to reduce the use of fossil fuels in Canada? And Charles, isn't it right that you're not only concerned about your own future? Yes, and also my children's future. Thank you very much, Charles. So this is an 11-year-old boy who's concerned about the future for his children. What would you answer, Mr. Trudeau?
First of all, thank you, Charles, for joining us, and thank you for your question. I hear this question a lot, not just from my own kids, but from kids all across Canada. And that's why we set up a plan that's very ambitious. We're putting a cap on the oil and gas industry's emissions to bring it down to net zero. We know we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions coming from the oil and gas industries. And we also need to help so that everyone can buy an electric car by 2035. All cars in Canada will be electric by then. Those are two concrete steps we're taking for you and for the next generation.
Mr. O'Toole.
Charles.
Thank you for the question. My children are young like Charles, and environment and climate change is important for me as the father of a family. And that's why in April we presented our policy on climate change. We need to meet our Paris targets, and we have a plan to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions while creating the jobs and opportunities that we'll need after the pandemic. We have a plan with a lot of details, Charles, with a price on carbon, with a personal carbon savings account. We're going to use technology like hydrogen and carbon capture, and we're going to work closely with Quebec on electric vehicles. We are going to act, Charles.
Thank you. Ms. Paul.
Thank you, Charles, for the question. In fact, we invited young supporters to come to our round tables over the last few months, and it's a source of anxiety for me to be honest. We are trying to be a party that brings people together, but there are differences here amongst our parties. We know full well that it's impossible to invest in oil and gas, in pipelines, exploration projects, and fracking, and reach our targets. There is only one choice when it comes to the climate in this election, but we do want to work with the other parties.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Blanchet.
Well, I know that the IPCC has said that Canada has a terrible record on climate change. It's not by investing 10 billion a year in the oil patch or billions, even billions more in buying a pipeline to carry oil by claiming saying that it's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're going to cap current oil production, and then we're going to limit it even more, and we're even going to fund this for Alberta, and we've also talked about ensuring that bank funding goes to green transition.
Thank you, and congratulations, Charles. It's incredible. You asked a question in front of many, many people. It's a great concern for me, too. I will soon be a father, like you would like to be one day, and I'm afraid for my child. This is an issue that we have to tackle head-on. Mr. Trudeau said that he wants to reduce emissions. Every target has been missed. Big oil has received subsidies. We want to truly tackle climate change. We will eliminate oil subsidies, and we will give you a brighter future. That is my commitment.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Thank you, Charles. You asked a question that many, many Canadians are asking. Stay involved, stay engaged, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Charles. Thank you. Thank you very much, Charles. Goodbye. I'm going to continue along the same vein. Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Blanchet, you have the floor. In the end, people are wondering a very simple thing. Mr. O'Toole, how do you reduce greenhouse gas emissions when you also want to increase oil production?
It's possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while creating jobs. We are going to have programs for becoming carbon neutral in the Western energy sector. We need to use technology like hydrogen here in Quebec. We will take an approach where we're working in partnership with the big emitters to reduce our emissions. And that's why we launched our platform in April. This is a very important issue, and I need to make sure that we regain trust on this issue. But we have a plan to meet our targets while creating the jobs we need for an economic recovery.
Well, all of a sudden, I think this idea is going to turn into a pumpkin, because it's impossible to reduce greenhouse gases by increasing oil development. However, it is possible to create more wealth by investing in green energies, in innovation, in production, in processing in different regions of Quebec with our own research centers. There is a way of doing things better, but we cannot rely on fossil fuels. That is the energy of the past.
You said that last week. It's possible to use technology like carbon capture, and it's important in the energy sector.
No, that's not what I said.
And it's important in the aluminum sector, for example, in the Saguenay. We need to have an economic recovery in the regions, and you've made decisions as a former environment minister in Quebec. You approved the biggest emitter in Quebec without an environmental assessment. We need to work in close collaboration with the provinces, Mr. Blanchet.
Mr. Blanchet, I'll allow you to reply, but I will quote you to yourself. You said, I will tell you without any hesitation that the Quebec government intends to move forward with the oil industry in Quebec. And that was on February 14, 2013 in a parliamentary committee. So, Mr. Blanchet, you were pro-oil in the case of Quebec.
I was you're not leaving me enough time, but I said that as a former Minister of the Environment, and I think that everyone was sincere. My job was to monitor things. There was going to be an environmental assessment after the exploration, after prospecting, and I think that we've all been to the same school. So what I did in the past 8 years has been very responsible. I never said that carbon capture was a solution. I said it does not exist except in the trees, and Mr. Trudeau
there is technology that works.
So you were allowed to reply. Ms. Paul, Mr. Singh, Mr. Trudeau. This is the great Canadian dilemma. We are an oil-producing nation that also wants to be green. Over the last 25 years, we've realized that these are we can't be reconciled.
It's not, because even if this transition can't happen overnight, it will happen in the years to come. We are seeing how our investments are helping with green energies, renewable energies, in the whole transformation of our energy sector. That's why we're putting a cap on emissions from the oil and gas industries so that it's carbon neutral, net zero. And we're going to encourage people to buy electric cars.
I have to add something, Mr. Trudeau. You've had 6 years. And truly, I'm sad, and it makes me sad to say so, but in 6 years, you have the worst record in amongst G7 countries. And the truth is, you've promised to eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, but instead of doing so, you've actually increased them. So how can people believe you?
We are the only party to clearly say that we will stop building pipelines. We will stop supporting fracking projects. We will not subsidize the oil and gas sector. And I am saying that as the sister of somebody who is working in Alberta in the oil and gas sector. And I'm saying it for my brother. The future here in Canada, yes, is energy, but it's renewable energy. Unfortunately, we are behind all our international partners. There is a green rush happening, and that's the future.
I completely agree, Ms. Paul. What we have to do is to make serious decisions, because we have a huge challenge ahead of us. We have to invest in renewable energy. We have to electrify transport. But we cannot allow ourselves to have 4 more years of Trudeau. A lot of words, but very little action.
I have a question for all 3 of you.
Should I not be allowed to reply? All the parties are saying they're serious tonight about the environment. We're a country of science, respects science, but the fact is we have to rely on our experts. And the experts, the environmentalists, the climate experts, everyone says that the Liberal Party has done the most.
This portion of the debate is over. Thank you. Mr. Trudeau?
And it breaks my heart, too, that you aren't talking about the environment in this campaign.
I now invite Paul Beaujournay to come and ask his questions. Good evening, Patrice. Mr. Singh, you want to help cities make urban transit free, but they already can't fund their current services, which are already insufficient. So how can that work?
Thank you for the question. We want to invest in collaboration with municipalities to help them with their transit, their public transit, because we know that a big GHG emitter is the transport sector. If we want to invest in our transit system, if we can help them to electrify the system, if we can work with provinces and territories also, that will really allow us to tackle climate change.
But if someone makes $900,000 or $90,000,
I believe that
it's
an option, and we will give municipalities the option to do so. What we really want to do is make significant investments in public transit, because it's important to do so.
Mr. Trudeau? You want to cap oil and gas emissions, but you're still granting drilling permits, especially in Newfoundland. When will you put an end to new projects?
First of all, with a cap on emissions from the oil and gas industries, it would be very hard to create new investment because current emissions will have to be reduced because that's what we need. So yes, over time, some projects will be kept and there will be some very tough criteria for their approval, but we will continue with the price on pollution.
But it's not clear, if you don't mind. Which year will the cap start, and how quickly will these go down? Will things go down quickly or gently?
It's going to be at the rate needed as determined by the experts. For the past 4 or 5 years already, there's been a cap, and they won't be able to go any higher.
Ms. Paul, in 2021, all federal parties have an environmental plan. According to the former leader of the BC Greens, your plan is not the best one. Does your party still serve a purpose?
He's wrong. And I say that as simply as that. I'm a lawyer, analyst. I'm very pragmatic. I looked for a party to join, and I wondered which party had the best plan for our future. And it's the Green Party. We know that it's impossible to continue to extract oil and gas, to continue to build pipelines, to continue to give the green light to exploration projects. It's impossible to do that. So our plan is practical, it's feasible, but it's also bold, and we need to do it.
Mr. O'Toole, you want to freeze the Liberals' carbon tax and create a savings account where the more gasoline you consume, the more credits you receive. How can you pollute less by consuming more?
We launched our plan in April, and your personal carbon savings account is your money. And if you transfer your money into your account, that means it's your money. But you are going to be able to make the decision to reduce your carbon footprint. This is an innovative approach, and we need to meet our targets. And that's why we launched our plan in April.
But a family, then the big winner is the couple with two SUVs.
Because they have to make their own decisions for green choices with their personal carbon savings account. And we will work in close collaboration, as I said, with the provinces and with the big emitters. And we have a plan with a lot of detail because this is an important issue for our country and for our world.
Mr. Blanchet? You want the third link between Quebec and Lévis to be funded by a federal green envelope. If it took place elsewhere in the country, would you say the same thing? Or are new highways only green in Quebec?
You know, as a party that depends provincial jurisdiction and Quebec jurisdiction, there are very good chances that I would not get involved, because that's what I advocate for Quebec as well. I'd like to say again, and I'm prepared to say it again, that is a provincial area of jurisdiction. That is the government, Quebec government, that is responsible for that. It is the one that has to do the consultations and the environmental assessment. And I am aware
but the environmental consideration?
This is something that...
But the question is that this is a federal green envelope. So should the green federal envelope fund a sprawl from coast to coast?
That is an infrastructure budget from the federal government, and the Quebec government asked that the entire infrastructure budget, because it's a provincial area of jurisdiction, be given to Quebec. And then Quebec can discuss with Lévis and Quebec City and the public, the citizens, who will have environmental requirements as well, because it requires social license.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Open debate now. You'll be able to come back to the environmental theme. I'll just give you a few numbers. Mr. O'Toole, you have targets of 30%. Your target is 30%. Mr. Trudeau, 40%. Ms. Paul, 60%. Mr. Singh and Blanchet, 50%. The truth is, and people know this and keep repeating it to me, is that for the last 24 years, no reduction targets set by Canada has been met. Mr. Trudeau, you start the open debate, please. How can people trust you?
First of all, according to the scientists and experts, we are already on track to exceed the targets set in Paris 5 years ago. We are going to reduce emissions by 36% by 2030. That's a fact.
You
We're going to go even
met
further
your targets, Mr. Trudeau.
and up to 40%. People know they need a government that will act concretely and ambitiously on climate change. Unfortunately, the Conservatives want to backtrack and go back to the Harper Plan and break the Paris Agreement.
That's not the case.
Break
Mr.
our
Roy.
commitment to that agreement, because we're already on track to exceed those targets.
Mr. Roy, Canadians deserve a government that's going to deliver on its targets. Mr. Trudeau, every year he's been Prime Minister, he has not met his targets. And Canadians deserve a concrete plan. And that's why we launched our plan in April with a price on carbon. And we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to meet our Paris targets. That's important for me, and I will deliver on that.
By investing in the Northern Gateway?
For me, it's not just words. It's not just words like we hear from Mr. Trudeau. We need to deliver on this important issue for Canadians and Quebecers.
Mr. Singh.
I'm going to say something strange. I completely agree with Mr. O'Toole that Mr. Trudeau has missed all of his objectives, but Mr. O'Toole will do the same. I would like to share a story. I met a young woman in Hamilton. She said, "What's the point of studying, finding a partner, and starting a family when I'm afraid of the future? I don't even know what's going to happen in the future." That is the crux of the matter. We can't just have someone that speaks a lot but doesn't actually act.
We've understood. Thank you. Mr. Blanchet.
I would call the current targets cowardly. Before, we used to respect Kyoto 1990, and then it went up again. But we are saying 37.5% on the previous cap, and that's 51% from 2005. And that is about what the Americans are pledging to do. So Canada is not even prepared to go as far as the Americans, who are also very large polluters and who also use oil a great deal. So I think we need courage. There are control mechanisms, for example, the carbon exchange.
Yes, I'd like to talk about that, and I'd like to speak directly to Canadians, because you know, your intuition is that it's not working. It's not working at all. Canada, first of all, is missing an opportunity, a historic opportunity to be at the top ranks of a green economy. We are headed nowhere. It's up to you to decide in this election. Do you want to continue on the same path after 6 years of failure, or do you want to move in a new direction? And that is really the choice you have. I'm sorry, Mr. Trudeau, to say that all scientists agree. Even scientists in the public service have said that with your plan, we won't succeed, even achieving half the targets.
The fact is that all the leaders here are relying on wishful thinking, except for the Liberal plan. You have to listen to the experts, listen to the scientists, listen to the climate experts. They're the ones who are saying that the Liberal plan is the most ambitious plan. It's the best plan. The others' plans are not up to the task to fight climate change.
Who is keeping their job after 6 years?
I say good luck to people listening at home. Now, let's go back to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Even you, Mr. Singh, said, yes, we'll have to keep operating that. So for how many years will you operate the Trans Mountain Pipeline?
I said that I was against this project. I've always been against, and I will continue to be against this project.
So you would shut it down?
I'm against this project. I've already said so.
But what happens then?
When we will be government, we'll take stock of the situation.
Mr. Trudeau, for how many years?
There are Indigenous communities interested in buying that pipeline, and they will continue to operate it until it's no longer needed, because that transition, we are going to embark on that transition to reduce emissions.
People are trying to understand, is it 10, 15, 20 years? Mr. O'Toole, what do you think?
Families in the West deserve an economic recovery as well, and it's possible to create jobs while reducing our emissions.
Thank you. Well, this is... Do you have an opinion on Trans Mountain?
I would offer it to people of Alberta so they can implement an energy transition because they need to diversify their economy.
Thank you. Moving on to the next theme.
Trans Mountain. Do you want my opinion? Trans Mountain is a project that is not even going to give a single cent of revenue, and furthermore, it violates the sovereignty of the Wet'suwet'en territory.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Moving on to the next theme. Indigenous people, identity and culture. And I'd like to tell people who are listening to us, we find ourselves in the Great Hall of the Canadian Museum of History. And this is a Great Hall that is dedicated to Indigenous culture. And you can see parts of the totem poles behind us, and that is why. Noemi, you've got a question from the public. Yes, we were all shocked when hundreds of Indigenous children's graves were discovered on the sites of former residential schools. There is much to be done, clearly, to achieve some form of reconciliation. Our next invited citizen is Perry Simon. He's a Mohawk, and he is originally from the community of Ganasatake. We're reaching him in Montreal. Good evening, Mr. Simon. Good evening, Ms. Mercier. Thank you so much for being here. The last few months have most certainly been hard for you, not only because of residential schools, but also because of the death of Joyce Echaquan at the Joliette Hospital, for example. How can we begin to right these wrongs? I see that you have your feather with you in your hand. This is a Mohawk tradition that signifies that it's your turn to speak in our discussion circle, in our talking circle. So please go ahead. We're listening. In 2021, it's time to recognize that we exist and that we share this land, our ancestors' land, with Canadians and Quebecers, to begin a true reconciliation. Would you be willing to include the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis languages among Canada's official languages? Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Simon. A very complex issue, a very clear and simple question. Mr. Blanchet, go ahead.
Mr. Simon, good evening, and I would like to pay tribute to you from nation to nation. The portion that is the responsibility of Quebec would have to be discussed with the Quebec government, and that has been raised. And it says that Bill 96 doesn't change anything of that, and I would say that from this perspective, because you talked about the fact that we share territory, and that is the real reality. We have to coexist in an enriching way for all nations, Canada, Quebec, and the First Nations on this one and same territory. And so clearly the answer is yes. On the territory, which is currently Canada and Quebec, Indigenous languages must receive official recognition and must be under the jurisdiction of Indigenous people.
Mr. Trudeau.
Thank you, Mr. Simon, for being here this evening and for your leadership. The fact is that we have worked with Indigenous people all across the country to develop together an official status for Indigenous languages. But I'd like to share a concrete example. Defending bilingualism, i.e. English and French, is very important. But we also made a difficult decision to appoint a Governor General who doesn't speak both official languages because she speaks one of them, and she speaks Inuktitut, which is the language she learned in her youth in northern Quebec. So it's obvious to me that we need to recognize the value of that culture so that we can all move forward together.
Mr. Simon, thank you very much for being with us here this evening. You've added something special and important to the debate, and I completely agree that we have to recognize Indigenous languages as official languages. This is a we can take, but it will have a profound impact on our country. We need also general measures. We have to recognize the fact that we have to follow all the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have to stop bringing to court Indigenous children, for example. But this subject you mentioned is also very important.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Simon, for your question. As somebody who's from a diaspora where we've lost all our culture and language, I recognize how important it is to keep your languages. So absolutely. In fact, I hesitate to even comment on this because I'm always trying to give our platform and allow the Indigenous leadership to speak for themselves. I hope that one day our party will have an Indigenous leader, because it is the time to have this kind of leadership. Yes, absolutely. We are allies when it comes to nation-to-nation building and sovereignty and self-determination.
Mr. O'Toole, to conclude.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. Miigwech. Reconciliation is a priority for all the leaders here tonight. My first question in the House of Commons as opposition leader was on reconciliation, and we need to act on the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation report, and I will act. When it comes to language, we need to deliver specific services in traditional Indigenous languages. And 2 weeks ago, we announced a historic investment in mental health for Indigenous people, for services in traditional languages.
Will they become official languages in this country? Should they be recognized officially as official languages in Canada?
We have two national languages right now, but it's possible to have services in Indigenous languages.
Thank you. Mr. Simon, thank you so much for having joined us tonight. You were courageous and eloquent. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. We're now going to have 2 5-minute blocks where I'm going to open up the microphone to everyone. I don't want to do too much back and forth, and I'd like to be as clear as possible for the viewers at home. So I'd like to ask you to speak about 2 important things. First of all, water on reserve, and secondly, the Wet'suwet'en crisis and treaty negotiations. The Wet'suwet'en crisis wasn't that long ago, although it might seem like it with the pandemic. Mr. Singh, we're starting with you. The Auditor General said again, a lot of money has been invested in this, but the boil water advisories still haven't been lifted. So what would you do to fix this problem on reserve?
You said Mr. Singh, but you're looking at someone else.
You were looking at someone else.
I'm wearing pink today to be very identifiable.
Yes, sorry, I got mixed up there. I did mean you, Mr. Singh. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I was just giving a little joke, but this is a very serious matter before us. I would like to clearly say this evening that in a rather rich country like Canada, it is completely unacceptable that we have Indigenous communities that don't have drinkable water. It's not a question of capacity, it's not a question of jurisdiction, it's a question of will. So when Mr. Trudeau started his actions at the beginning of the pandemic, he invested billions in banks, but he shattered his promise to deliver drinking water. So I'm not going to accept the fact that it was a lack of capacity. It's a crying shame.
Mr. Trudeau, the Auditor General talked about an outdated funding formula, And this is a report that dates from just a few months ago.
Well, it's been decades. We've had this challenge of drinking water on reserves, and that's why we promised to put an end to the problem. We eliminated 109 boil water advisories. There are still some left. We're working actively in each and every community. We have a plan. We have a representative who's doing the job. We will get there. Yes, the pandemic got in the way a bit, but it's not an excuse. We are going to complete that work.
Mr. O'Toole?
Yes, Mr. Trudeau has broken his promise when it comes to drinking water. And reconciliation is a question of trust between First Nations and the federal government. That's why it's very important that we have a plan, not just words. We need to deliver because drinking water on reserve is a right. We need to deliver, working in partnership with Indigenous leaders, with Indigenous businesses, and I will create a plan to deliver in partnership.
Ms. Paul.
Yes, again, I speak directly to Canadians, and I would say exactly that is the reason why we want more diversity in politics. Because if there were more people who had the experience of living without drinking water, it would be a greater priority. It's only the will that is missing. Our investments in TMX and pipelines is more profitable than to pay for boil water, or drinking water in the Indigenous communities.
We have the right to assess a government based on the results that it delivers. And with the support of the House of Commons, that it would receive with regard to drinking water. And yet, after all these years, this government has not been able to devote the financial resources and infrastructure to ensure that there is drinking water in Indigenous communities under its federal jurisdiction. This is a national shame, and everyone has to say that this is going to be fixed now to the satisfaction of Indigenous communities affected.
Now, in the next leaders' debate, it would be great if we didn't have to be asking this question, right? Now, there were rail blockades in Canada last year. Mr. Trudeau, have the negotiations moved forward?
Yes, it has moved forward. Progress has been made because we resisted calls from the Conservatives and others to send the army and the police in. We opted for negotiation instead. It took a few days longer, and even though the crisis lasted longer than a week, we were able to resolve it peacefully, harmoniously. It was settled, and we continue to work hand in hand in partnership and respect.
Thank you, Mr.
That's
Trudeau.
the only way to move
We'll
forward.
come back to this in the next section. Now I'd like to welcome Guillaume Bourgault-Côté to ask his questions. Good evening, everyone. Mr. O'Toole, let's start with you. You're talking about scrapping Bill C-10, which taxes web giants like Netflix and Spotify. And you also say that you want digital platforms to reinvest a significant portion of their revenue to fund Canadian series, films, and music. So would a significant portion mean more or less than the $830 million that the Liberals are proposing?
I am proud of our artists in Quebec and in Canada and our content creators, and we need to have a level playing field while respecting our values and freedom of expression. And that's why we are going to work with the cultural sector to protect our economy and to help our artists while respecting the freedom of expression. That's our approach.
Would you have a quota for how much you want to get from the web giants?
We are going to help the sectors that have been the worst hit by the pandemic, artists, musicians. We are going to help artists who are facing a crisis right now. That's part of our plan for Canada's recovery.
Ms. Paul, French is already the official language of Quebec, so why are you reluctant to have it recognized in the Constitution, as provided for in the Legault government's reform of Bill 101?
I don't hesitate at all. My two children are part of the Francophonie. My mother made a huge effort to ensure that I was bilingual. I spent an hour and a half each way going to school. It is very important to protect French and to strengthen French. Unfortunately, it's becoming almost impossible to get a bilingual education in Canada.
But I'm talking about recognizing French as the official language of Quebec in the Constitution.
I didn't say that at all. If you're talking about the Bill 96, what I'm saying is that there are constitutional issues that are raised. We have to look at them, that's all.
But you don't have any problem with the substance?
Not at all.
Okay, Mr. Singh, you've said that you're against Quebec bashing, but when one of your members supported a professor who says that Quebec culture is racist, you let it slide. So what would you say to Quebecers who have the impression that on this issue, you're saying one thing and doing the opposite?
Quite the contrary. I've always said that I'm against Quebec bashing. All of our MPs are against Quebec bashing. And we've said that this kind of systemic discrimination has no place in our society. We are against this. We will always be an ally for Quebec. We will defend the French language. We will defend Quebec's interests. That is something that is close to me because the late Jack Layton started with the Sherbrooke Declaration, and we will continue with that momentum. Quebec has the right, has many rights. We will continue to support them.
But why did you not call out your member?
I had words with that MP. He recognized his mistake, and we will continue to say that we are a party that is an ally to Quebec.
Thank you. Mr. Blanchet, the Court Challenges program helps defend the rights of minorities, as we saw with Francophones at the Montfort Hospital, for example. Now, you're asking the next government to interfere in the management of this independent program, to say, don't touch Quebec's secularism bill. So do you agree with political intervention like this only when it suits you?
I'm going to repeat what I said during the scrum yesterday. First of all, the Bloc has always been in favor of the Court Challenges program, and yet the government entrusted it to an institution that used it as a political tool against Quebec values, saying that those who are against Bill 21 or against Bill 96 are wrong, and that is very problematic in an institution that shut down a professor but allows the professor to speak. And I'm saying either the minister has to assume this program or the minister has to change things. But it should not be entrusted to an institution that is systematically going to attack Quebec.
And do minorities in Quebec have the right to funding to protect their rights, in your opinion?
There's quite a difference between saying we're going to give $250,000 to the English Montreal School Board to challenge a law of Quebec, whereas this is under Quebec jurisdiction. Think of the Montfort Hospital case.
Mr. Trudeau, it's been 4 years. 4 years since you promised that web giants would fund Canadian cultural content. And yet nothing has changed. You had a bill on the issue, but it didn't pass because you called an election. So are you serious about this issue?
I think that artists in Quebec, all across the country, know how much we've been there for them during the pandemic, but even before. We reversed the terrible trend under the Conservatives. They were always attacking artists. We were there for CBC, for our artists. We've continued to ensure that giants of the web like Netflix are investing in Quebec. And with the international community, we've gotten together to try to make sure that all companies pay their fair share of taxes. We have Bill C-10, which we put forward, and it was slowed down largely because of the Conservatives, and the other parties were not always ready to support that. But we were there for artists, and we will still be there.
Thank you. Thank you, Guillaume. Now, we'll answer the following question. There was an article in Radio-Canada that really shocked a lot of people recently. Now, in the name of reconciliation, a school board in Ontario burned books. I'd like to go through here one by one, starting with Mr. Blanchet. Do leaders need to have a clear position on this type of action?
Of course. And I'm fairly satisfied, though, because what I said yesterday with regard to Montreal that said that I should recognize the Quebec Nation, or the Providence School Board saying that it's not a good idea to burn books, and I'm happy to see that everyone agrees. I think that we have to have the courage to affront something that in the past in global literature says might not be politically correct today. And we still need to teach young people and to prepare them for the future.
Mr. Trudeau, was it not your job as leader to clearly denounce this yesterday morning? Because you can't do anything in the name of reconciliation.
Absolutely. And I did clearly state that burning books was unacceptable. At the same time, we're not going to tell Indigenous peoples how they should feel. There's a balance to be struck, and that's very important.
Mr. O'Toole.
Burning books is always unacceptable in a society like ours. And we need to focus on reconciliation without attacks, without taking steps like that.
Ms. Paul, what do you think about this?
First of all, yesterday was a Jewish holiday. I'm Jewish, so I wasn't aware of that until today. Obviously, there are better ways to express oneself, but we know that there's a great deal of frustration, on the other hand, in Indigenous communities, in the Black community as well. We've been waiting for decades for action, for criminal justice changes. People get frustrated, and the time for action comes. And I hope we'll be able to find better ways to do that, but we need to find solutions.
Mr. Singh, I want to hear from everyone here, so we'll go to Mr. Singh.
I don't think that it's a good idea to burn books. We have to retain history, to remember what people did in the past. I deeply understand that Indigenous peoples had a lot of problems with how their culture was taught when I was young. The way Indigenous history was taught to me was not respectful, did not follow Indigenous teachings. And so we need to have a serious dialogue on how we must teach Indigenous people's contributions.
Mr. Trudeau, the woman who initiated this action is on the Liberal Indigenous Council, but she no longer is that correct?
Who resigned from her position.
And in fact, she was not even Indigenous. So sometimes you can go a bit too far, even with good intentions.
I'd be very careful when contradicting or making decisions about how a person identifies themselves or not as belonging to a certain community or not. We have to leave a lot of room for personal identity. I'm not defending anything here, but I think everyone should be very careful.
Just to conclude.
Be careful. He says he imposes things on the Indigenous peoples. So why is he doing the same thing to Quebec?
Because I am a Quebecer.
That still doesn't give you the right to impose things.
You keep forgetting, I'm a Quebecer. I'm a proud Quebecer. I've always been a Quebecer. I will always be a Quebecer. And I will always have a say in what happens in Quebec. You do not have a monopoly over Quebec. Many of us represent Quebec in the House of Commons. And I'd like to say to you this, Mr. Blanchet. When you say, Mr. Blanchet, that you don't want any interference from the federal government in Quebec, and
I'm the only leader who can replace Mr.
Trudeau. The Quebec government's record as if it's your own. It's a contradiction. You have no right to consider me not a Quebec
democracy is heard in the National Assembly of
and
Quebec.
in the government of Canada.
Yes, Mr.
It doesn't
Blanchet.
always go. It should not go against the National Assembly.
And Mr. Blanchet,
Mr. O'Toole,
I am the only leader
20
who
seconds.
can replace Mr. Trudeau, and we have a plan, and we need to listen to Quebecers. We need to act for Quebecers.
A plan and a contract.
Well, it's normal for debates to pick up some speed like this. Let's move on to the next theme.
Justice
and Foreign Affairs. Naomi has a question from the public. Yes. The evacuation operation in Afghanistan has ended in chaos. There are 1,250 Canadian nationals and their family members who remain trapped there. To this number must be added almost 10,000 Afghans who collaborated with Canadian forces and who now fear for their lives with the Taliban in power. Catherine Rusk is the sister of Captain Nicolas Godard, who was killed in action in Kandahar in 2006. She joins us from Vancouver. Good evening, Ms. Rusk. Good evening. You founded an organization to help Afghan civilians who supported Canadian forces. You are trying to bring in the interpreter who worked for your sister. You have a question for the leaders this evening? We're listening. Canada has taken far too long to act. For my sister, the most important thing was her responsibility towards her team. For her, interpreters were part of the team. She would never have wanted them to be abandoned. What will you do to evacuate the Canadians and Afghan interpreters who were left behind? Thank you very much for that question, Ms. Rusk. Ms.
Thank
Paul,
you very much for that
you
question.
have the first response.
And I say sincerely that I never would have called an election when we had Canadians and people who supported us during our mission in Afghanistan. I had already asked all the leaders of the parties to take part in an emergency debate, but you are quite right. Canada must respect our promises, the promises made. We must do that. Otherwise, we won't be allies, we won't have international partners. It is now the time to focus on the evacuation of our citizens and those who helped us.
Thank you very much. Mr. Singh?
Thank you, Ms. Rusk, and thank you for your family's service. What has happened is simply inconceivable. The fact that our allies that jeopardized their very lives to help our Canadian forces were simply left behind. It's completely unacceptable. We saw videos of what's happening in Afghanistan. This is a human rights tragedy. People are being threatened. Some of them may lose their lives, and so I agree with Ms. Paul. We should never have triggered an election, and now we have to do everything we can to save the lives of our allies.
Thank you. Mr. O'Toole?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Rusk. The situation in Afghanistan is very sad for women and girls there, but also for our military families and our veterans. And unfortunately, Mr. Trudeau has abandoned our interpreters and our workers on the ground there. And unfortunately, months ago, our veterans asked for an action plan on Afghanistan, but Mr. Trudeau called an election. He ignored the problem, and as usual, he did nothing. As a veteran, I will act in our interests here and around the world.
Thank you. Mr. Trudeau?
Ms. Rusk, I understand your pain and frustration. Canadians made a lot of sacrifices to improve the lot of women and girls and the Afghan people, and your family sacrificed more than any family should ever have to. So I understand your pain and the desire of all Canadians to continue helping Afghanistan out, and that's what we will do. We did act quickly from the very outset. We had an evacuation plan. We evacuated 3,700 people, a lot more than our European allies did, and we will continue to be there to help Canadians who remain behind, to help them get out, and thousands of other people that we will bring to
Thank
Canada.
Mr. Blanchet?
What should we do
Ms. Rusk. First, we have to recognize that Canada is not an international power. And that's a problem because it means that Canada cannot act except by working with allies, and Canadian credibility in the past years has deteriorated, especially with the United States. And Saudi Arabia is a pitiful example of this behavior. There are 90 countries who would say that they would not recognize the Taliban regime and that are ready to exert pressure, but we need concerted pressure to means that the Taliban the monopoly over the interpreters should
Thank you,
ease a
Mr.
bit.
Blanchet. Thank you very much, Ms. Rusk, for having given us this message this evening. Have a good evening. Thank you, Ms. Rusk. Thank you so much. I now call upon Marie Vastel of Le Devoir, who has questions for the leaders. Good evening. Mr. Blanchet, I'll begin with you. When it comes to immigration, you want to prioritize welcoming French-speaking refugees in Quebec, but we know that the majority of refugees abroad do not speak French. What would you do about them?
I would like to say something. I want to Canada stop penalizing Francophone students, foreign students who come here. Those who come from Africa, 90% of them are being turned down, and yet they're Francophones and they want to come to Quebec. So it's a type of discrimination against them that really harms the French language with regard to welcoming refugees and immigrants. As I have said many times, I am extremely open to that.
But your platform talks about welcoming French-speaking refugees. Does that mean that Quebec would welcome less than its share of refugees?
It means that we do everything that we can to accept as many as possible. It doesn't mean we're not assuming our responsibility, and we're coming back to the same issue. What can we use as resources to teach French to those people who come to live in Quebec?
Thank you. Mr. Singh, good evening. You want to become Prime Minister of a G7 country, but your election platform barely contains a few general ideas on foreign policy. What, in your opinion, should be the first act of the next government, first foreign policy act?
If we're talking about what we can do globally, Mr. Trudeau said that Canada is still on its way up, but our investments in economic development are incredibly low. It's not at a level that a G7 country should have. We also have to come back as a country of diplomacy that respects peace, that respects human rights through tangible measures.
And very quickly on China, for example, you talk about standing up to China. And how is that, what's the difference for you?
The big difference is that we had a vote to recognize the Uyghur genocide. Mr. Trudeau was not in the House of Commons. None of his ministers, none of his cabinet were there, which is a lack of leadership.
You were not even consulted by the American president when the U.S. decided to keep the border closed to Canadians. How can you defend the country's interests if you cannot even speak directly to Joe Biden when it counts?
On the contrary, Marie, I have frequently spoken with President Biden about the borders in order to coordinate as much as possible. But it's not for the U.S. to tell us how to manage our border, nor is it the other way around, up to us to tell them how to manage the border. But throughout the pandemic, Canadians were free to fly to the U.S., whether they were vaccinated or not. And we put measures in place requiring quarantine when the Americans
With respect to your relationship with Mr. Biden, there were only 3 phone calls. Has President Biden forgotten about you?
Not at all. We spent a whole day together discussing things. As soon as he arrived, it was his first foreign visit, and we discussed the steps we're going to take together. Our relations with the U.S. are excellent.
Ms. Paul, the Israel issue almost imploded your party recently. Unlike you, your activists take a hard line against Israel. Have you reconciled with them? And what position do you now defend?
First of all, I don't accept the premise of the question. The Green Party is a party that believes in nonviolence, dialogue, and reconciliation. We apply that in all situations. We are also a party that believes in international law. As a former diplomat for Canada and advisor at the International Criminal Court, I am someone who follows international law.
But on Israel, Ms. Paul, your position is not in your platform. Can you tell us what your position is?
We do not have a position on international conflicts in our platform. We have rather rules and principles, and we apply them to all situations.
Thank you. Mr. O'Toole, on China, in closing, you say that you would adopt a harder line than Mr. Trudeau, but even our allies are not going as far as what you're proposing. Do you not fear even more economic sanctions and more Canadians being held hostage?
No, we need to have a more serious approach when it comes to China. Mr. Trudeau has always mishandled this file, particularly when it comes to the genocide. He wasn't there for the vote on the genocide in China. Our allies are opposed to having Huawei in our 5G system. We're the only country in the Five Eyes in favor of Huawei. We need to have a level playing field for international trade, for steel and aluminum. Mr. Obama started that, but Mr. Trudeau was once again too slow.
But we did see sanctions and reprisals. Would there not be even further reprisals?
We need to defend our values and our citizens. And the Magnitsky sanctions are very important. They allow us to act against the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marie. We are running out of time. We've moved on to the final open debate, ladies and gentlemen. This will go quickly now. The Montreal mayor, accompanied by other mayors, said that they were extremely concerned. Madame Plante said, we're moving towards an American-style society in which it becomes every day, we see shootings every day. And Mr. Régis Labaume, the mayor of Quebec, said, let's not wait to become the Wild West like our dear neighbors to the south. Are you going to maintain all the firearms?
I will maintain the restrictions in place for firearms, and I will take politics out of the system. And the mayors are right. We need to target street gangs and gun smuggling. We have a plan to do that, working in close collaboration with police forces, municipalities, because we've seen shootings in Montreal, in Vancouver, with weapons smuggled in.
Because you changed your platform 3 times.
We need to have an approach that's transparent.
Very well.
Because we need to take politics out of this question.
Mr. Blanchet, on that subject?
I have a plan, I have a contract, and once it's signed, I'm going to change it. That's his message.
I'll send it to you, Mr. Blanchet.
And it's all the same results. You could use the word vague because it is very vague. At least the Liberals, they accepted the constraint in their buyback program. The Bloc is very clear. We said that we are going to make both handguns and assault weapons. They will be banned. We have to change the criminal code, give the tools to the Quebec government and the police forces, because this is making the Montreal streets into a
Mr. Trudeau,
battle of organized crime.
When it comes to handguns, the mayors for years now have said, please don't dump this into our backyard. Take care of it and ban these weapons everywhere.
First of all, people know full well that we've always been there to strengthen provisions against firearms, and we will continue to be there. Yes, we have taken steps to ban these weapons, and we are giving provinces like Quebec, those provinces that wanted, the power to ban these weapons on their turf. Now, we are showing leadership. It's very important. And Mr. O'Toole has refused to tell Quebecers and Canadians what he plans to do. He's cutting deals with special interest groups, like he's done with vaccines, like he's done with so-called pro-choice people, because the majority of his members are against women's choice. He would go back to Harper's climate plan. It would be a backward step. He,
Mr. Trudeau,
finally costed his platform, but we can see in that platform that it doesn't reflect Canadians' priorities. He can't be clear about it.
Mr. Trudeau would say anything to win. I am pro-choice. I will act on public safety because we've seen an increase in shootings because of illegal firearms. We've seen an increase in smuggling at the border. We've seen that at Roxham Road, for example. We need to have a serious approach on public safety.
He's a pro-choice leader, but most of his members do not
are in the middle of an election in a pandemic.
And the same thing on vaccines. He won't even require his own members
to be Why are we in an election
members
in
of
the middle of a
parliament, his own
pandemic, Mr. Trudeau?
candidates, to be vaccinated.
It's two sides of the same coin. It's the old parties. Mr. Trudeau promised to have a buyback. That never happened.
That's not
a shattered
true.
promise. Mr. Trudeau shatters his promises, so how can we believe him? I'm clearly saying, here and now, for the future, we cannot allow ourselves 4 more years of this approach of saying one thing, doing something else, compromising, making promises and then shattering them. We can't do that.
Ms. Paul, please go ahead.
When it comes to guns, I went into politics, in all honesty, for politics and not partisanship. If we talk about guns and assault weapons, yes, we have to abolish assault firearms. We have to respect the mayors. We have to attack the roots of these problems. The lack of affordable housing, things that lead to crime. This is really the issue. Will we address the sources of these problems, or will we continue to treat the symptoms?
Very well. Everyone had a chance to speak on firearms. I must ask you a question, even though we're almost out of time, about francophones living in a minority language situation. Will you help? For example, the Saint Jean campus in the University of Sudbury, University of Moncton, who are vulnerable before all these provincial cutbacks.
Yes,
Please.
absolutely. We have funds in our plan to help Francophone minority communities from one ocean to another. They are a strength for our country, and we are going to modernize the Official Languages Act. After 6 years of inaction from Mr. Trudeau, Francophone minority communities outside of Quebec deserve action.
Very well. 20 seconds each.
Moncton, St. John campus, and the Francophone University of Ontario, it was the Conservative government that made cuts to minority languages. It's not going to be Aaron O'Toole or Jason Kennedy or something. We have been there all along.
As a mother of 2 Francophone sons, I say yes, yes, and yes when it comes to the French language. I love the French language. We need to protect it. We need to ensure that everybody has access to a bilingual education if they so wish.
Again, beautiful words from Mr. Trudeau, but in the field, in Sudbury, his team was not present. His team was not there to defend the French language, to defend these institutions. Our team was there. We will always defend Francophone institutions because this makes our society flourish even more than before. French is an advantage, is an asset.
Mr. Blanchet, you have the last word.
Mr. Bloc Québécois will continue to be the voice and often usually the only voice for Francophones outside of Quebec and Acadians. The Official Languages Act is devoted to French outside of Quebec, and Quebec can manage its own issues.
Thank you. Thanks to all 5 of you, I hope. ladies and gentlemen, that you have learned something tonight. I'd like to thank Noémie also for being my host, and thank you to the members of the public who participated. This is a precious and useful exercise. I think it was fairly clear. Thank you for showing such discipline. Don't forget to vote. Please go vote on September 20th. I wish you all a good evening, and I'd like to thank the entire team, the entire production team.